for another minute or so? Okay, I see that it's now being live streamed, so I'll repeat this again. We're going to start in about another minute so that everybody has a chance to join us who plans to be here. We can talk about the weather for a minute if the panelists would like. I think we probably could get started. I see that there are almost 40 people now, and others will join. Welcome everybody to this panel roundtable discussion on the wonderful block of essays on revisiting the Soviet Jewry movement in the latest issue of Jewish Currents. Here is the latest issue of Jewish Currents. You should all have it. All the essays are online, but this is really a beautiful sort of work in and of itself, the physical copy. So I'm Sasha Senderovich. I was on a panel of people together with Anna Stornches, Tove Benjamin, but also those who are not on screen, Julia Alexeyeva and Olga Mironova, kind of advising the editorial board of Jewish Currents on this special issue, and it's just wonderful to see it out in print. Today, we're talking about the kind of core piece of the special issue, which is a block of essays on the Soviet Jewry movement, which was proposed and very expertly put together by Tove Benjamin, who is with us today. Tove Benjamin is a PhD candidate at New York University studying Russian and Jewish history. She was born in Chicago and lives in Brooklyn, and is doing dissertation research on Jews and grain, which is a really very important and very topical issue right now, if you're following the war in Ukraine. And we'll have three other participants in this roundtable. We'll have Hadass Benyamini, who is a PhD student in history and Hebrew and Judaic studies at New York University. Also be joined by Jonathan Deckel-Hen, who is Rabbi Edward Sandor Chair in Soviet and East European Jewry at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, whose research deals with modern Jewish history, transnational philanthropy and advocacy, non-state diplomacy, agrarian history, and migration. I'm very familiar and fond of his book on Farming the Red Land, which is about Jewish agricultural colonies in the Soviet Union. And also Anna Stornches, who is the Al and Malka Green Professor of Yiddish Studies and Director of the Ann Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. She's the author of Soviet and Kosher, Jewish Popular Culture in the Soviet Union, and When Sonia Met Boris, An Oral History of Jewish Life Under Stalin, which was published by Oxford in 2017. And she's currently working on a book about Yiddish music created in Nazi-occupied Ukraine. I guess I should more formally introduce myself. I'm an assistant professor of Russian, Jewish, and International Studies at the University of Washington. And I just published a book called How the Soviet Jew Was Made that came out literally a week ago. So I'm still kind of coming off high from that. And I wanted to get us started by kind of thinking about maybe what brought each of us, some of us, to this subject. So I thought I would open, at my rights as the moderator, I will open with some show and tell, which is some of the kind of paraphernalia of the Soviet Jewry movement, the various pins. I have a stamp that somebody can stamp their mail. Say, remember Soviet Jews. There's incorrect Russian on here and also correct Hebrew. And then the most interesting, this tzedakah box with money in it, which I discovered in my in-laws' laundry room about 2 or 3 years ago. It's been taped and retaped multiple times from sometime in the 1980s or the 1990s. And I figured I would take the quarters because they were collecting them for me, essentially, for the Soviet Jew who arrived. And kind of my encounter with the topic was, I grew up in the Soviet Union in the later years of the Soviet Union, moved to America in 1997, much later than any of the events that we're discussing today. But through my experience of kind of meeting other American Jews and being married to one, I've come sort of to encounter this story of how Soviet Jews were imagined by American Jews in a very interesting way. And that, kind of personal motivation also led me eventually to kind of look at this in a more scholarly way. I've written a couple of articles on contemporary American literature, American Jewish literature written by Soviet-born Jewish authors who think about these questions. So maybe I wanted to start with a question to whichever panelists would like to answer this question on your own subject position in regards to this topic and kind of what brought you to this question. So maybe somebody could sort of signal if they want to answer, and we'll take it from there. Jonathan. You need to unmute, Jonathan.
Yes, of course. First, thank you, Sasha, and thanks to Jewish Currents for going forward with this issue and then bringing us all together for this webinar. I guess I'm the oldest amongst this group, and hence I came to this subject by virtue of having actually quite fond memories of being an adolescent, I would say, and at my synagogue in youth group in Connecticut in the United States, long before I moved to Israel, participating actively in the Soviet Jewry movement by writing postcards to pen pals in the Soviet Union, participating here and there in demonstrations where they occurred not far from my home. And it really seemed to me that at the time, as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, that I was really participating in a kind of global campaign for brothers and sisters of mine who I had never met. And that rather idyllic memory, which is still idyllic for me, came not necessarily into conflict, but met head on with realities that I encountered much, much later as a scholar about things that are more factual and from other sides of this campaign. So for me, it's both, coming to this is both a part of a personal journey, but also trying to make sense of that personal journey within a more scholarly prism.
Anybody else? Yeah, would anybody else? Tova.
Sure, I'll jump in. So I didn't grow up, at all participating in the Soviet Jewry movement. That was before my time, but I think it's very helpful how Jonathan frames it, because that conflict was something that interested me in this history. And I was actually introduced to it by Gennady Estrev, who's my advisor at NYU and a wonderful historian. And he basically introduced me to this history of, this 30-year massive Jewish political movement, what we're now calling the Soviet Jewry movement. And I did also kind of grow up with some of these stories, right? Like I remember in summer camp, we used to sing this song that was literally called The Russian Boy's Helpless Plight. And it was just all about how, Jews were rescuing Jews from the Soviet Union. But when I learned about this history as an adult, it kind of threw all of that into question. And I think first and foremost, this idea that American and Israeli Jews were these saviors, right, of a helpless Soviet Jewry. And I started to read what had been published about it, and also a lot of this intense nostalgia that I think exists today in much American and Israeli sort of Jewish spaces. And I felt kind of that there was something that I didn't understand or that I was missing, like, first of all, just what was this movement? Was it a human rights movement? Was it a Zionist movement? Who did it serve? Was it for Israel? Was it for American Jews? Did it kind of serve to build Jewish identity? Was it actually for Jews in the Soviet Union? And then how did it happen, right? Like, how did it start? So In the introduction, we talk about how in 1987, you have 250,000 Jews that are gathering on the Washington Mall, and they're asking, for freedom of immigration and religion, et cetera. I mean, that doesn't come from nowhere. That's a really big political moment. And so I basically just became very interested in those basic questions. And that's what drew me to originally pitch this just as a revisionist single public history piece for Jewish Currents. And it ended up growing into what you see now, the section in the issue. And we can, talk about this later, but originally the thing that brought me in was that I was very fascinated by the version of Jewish identity that crystallized through this organizing and how that Jewish identity was used to advocate for a Jewish cause specifically, right? So the original piece that I wrote was titled "When Jews Organize as Jews for Jews." And I think that was interesting to me because the question was, well, in what ways are Jews a politicized identity? Are Jews still kind of in the post-war period a politicized identity? And in this case, the Jews, as part of the Soviet Jewry movement, they were picking up this cause of Jewish suffering as they framed it in another country. And so why was that the case?
Thank you, Tova. Hadass, what brought you to the subject?
So similarly to Tova, I'm a graduate student at New York University, where Gennady Esrach teaches this class every year. So people in our department are aware of this history and ponder it. And as a student of American Jewish political history, this has played a prominent role in that history. And I think in my reading, coming across it for the first time, there were three things that seemed especially compelling about what this movement is for American Jews. One is just the organizing feat, the grassroots organizing. So as someone who has been involved in my union, who has phone banked, who has tried to get people to take collective action for something, this is not intuitive in any way. It's extremely challenging. And a group of people in the US took an issue that wasn't really on many people's agenda and made it a part of global power politics. And I think just the mechanics, and I'm thinking specifically about the student struggle for Soviet Jewry and some of their early organizing. Some of the organizing strategies that they use to put it on the map are, as a novice organizer, extremely fascinating and good to learn. So that was the first thing that was striking. And then there are two other questions. One is the level of consensus that this issue had among American Jews. And I think as a historian, every time there's the appearance of consensus, support for anything, it raises red flags. So I was very curious about this. How did a community we know is very diverse, this is American Jews, fight amongst themselves about everything, reach this level of consensus? Was there actually consensus? Was this actually so uniform? This really intrigued me. And then the last thing is how a movement that in the beginning was subversive, it was a minority cause, and presented itself as a subversive anti-establishment movement, by the end of it aligned perfectly with state interests and with the interests of more of a renewed Cold War and of specific elements of the political establishment, while still retaining its subversive identity and self-image. And all of those questions really made this movement extremely compelling to study.
Thank you, Hadass. And Anna, if you'd like to answer, what brought you to this? What brought you to this question?
Oh, to the question or to the issue? Tova brought me to the issue.
to writing this for the issue. Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm a historian of Soviet Jewish experience, and I've written 2 books on this. And I've never, ever thought about Soviet Jewry movement, because in my mind, it has been a movement that unified American Jews and the Western Jewish community to rescue us, Soviet-born Jews. And in so many ways, like, it didn't feel like such an important part of history that I was studying. But then, Tova started working on this issue. She called me, and both Hadass and Tova actually, did some of their degrees in Toronto. Tova did her undergraduate, Hadass did her graduate degree too. So I've known them well, and I don't know, I just thought it would be interesting to think about this movement, also work with people for whom it's like complete history, you know what I mean? Like for Tova and Hadass, like for them, it's like, for me, I don't know, moon landing or something happened long time ago, important, but long time ago. So I thought it would be interesting to look at the Soviet Jewish experience through that lens. And that's how it happened.
Thank you. So now everybody who wants to be here is here. We have a much bigger audience. So actually I want to say things that I didn't say in the beginning because we were not here. So some practical issues first for the audience. Chat is open. If you would like to share a story, if you would like to tell us anything about yourself, that's where you would write it in the chat. We're not necessarily going to be able to monitor this through the conversation, but this will be archived and we'll look at it later. If you would like to ask a question to the panel, you have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Right, that's where you should type out your question to the panel, and I'll keep an eye on these, and I will try to incorporate them into the discussion. So that's kind of two practical issues for the panel. So thank you all for talking about what brought you to this, and now let's kind of dive into the issue. So one of the really compelling ways in which this was put together by Tova and by other editors was to think about the question or the story of the Soviet Jewry movement as a story that has a kind of mythology of a unified global Jewish communal event, but it takes to that mythology and it sees it as necessary to tell that story in parts, right? That instead of kind of this myth of unified Jews, actually a couple of three, at least, different domestic stories is one way you can look at this. And between our three panelists, we have a piece by Anna Sternches that looks at the Soviet part of the story, and it revisits kind of a central, I guess, mythology of the Soviet Jewry movement is that the Soviet Jews wanted to leave the Soviet Union primarily because of anti-Semitism. So Anna Sternches' essay looks at how that kind of thinking is itself a product of the way that American Jews saw Soviet Jews, and ignoring a lot of the other reasons why Soviet Jews may have wanted to leave, such as economic issues of wanting to have a different kind of possibility for different sort of social possibilities for themselves. So that's the Soviet story. And in the issue itself, there's also another wonderful piece by Eliasa Shaido-Kamerman, who is not on our panel, that talks about the activists in the Soviet Jewry movement, and looking as an anthropologist at some of their kind of daily lives and practices as people who were kind of having fun, right? Learning Hebrew, doing these things that were seen as being done because they're being oppressed by the Soviet state, but they were finding these sort of interesting ways of engaging with their Jewish identities precisely because of the Soviet state and because it allowed them through that kind of experience to engage with it. And there's also a piece by Emily Tamkin in the issue about the Soviet Jewish dissidents who were interested in global universal human rights and not so much in Jewish immigration. So that's the Soviet story. Then we have the Israeli part of the story that Jonathan Deckelhan writes about in this issue, trying to think about how, again, the kind of the mythology is that Israel was the driving force behind the Soviet Jewry movement. Jonathan Deckelhan looks at this critically and at the archival record, thinking about how Israel was actually quite reluctant to engage in some parts of this question as a state kind of located between superpowers, warring superpowers, as sort of one issue, and then dealing with a host of other domestic concerns. And then Hadass Benyamini, in this block of articles, writes about the United States, American part of the story, thinking about American domestic and international Cold War politics in the way how the Soviet Jewry activism dovetailed with the rise of political neoconservatism in the United States, primarily in the circles of the senator from my state of Washington, Henry Jackson, after whom my department is named, where I teach at the University of Washington, and kind of the interests of the activists, American activists in the Soviet Jewry movement, ended up dovetailing with some of the kind of hawkishness to the Soviet Union that became the defining feature of the neoconservative movement. So there are these kind of at least three different stories. So I wanted to ask the panelists about some of what you've maybe found most challenging in conceptualizing your essay to tell your part of the story as it would add up to this kind of global view. Jonathan?
Thank you, Sasha, and also for sort of beautifully summarizing and synthesizing the essays. It's sort of part of my journey in writing this piece and thinking more broadly about the Soviet Jewry movement is making sense of what I believe to be true about the movement as a kid growing up in the United States, having moved to Israel and most definitely being a subject of and participant in the Israeli national narrative, which sees in which Israel considers itself sort of the nexus, the axis of the Jewish world and all of the diasporas around it. And then as a scholar studying Soviet Jewry and being very familiar, certainly over the last 20 years, with a great many former Soviet Jews and former activists in the movement. And as a result of these three both intersecting but very different life experiences, I found that the balancing of what are essentially three very different narratives. I mean, we would probably like to think that all of the three parts here, or the four parts of this, were working, like some well-oiled machine, and that everyone had a more or less similar end game. But I think, as you summarized our essays, and anyone who's looked at, again, globally, not narrowly at one piece of the movement, realizes that that wasn't the case at all. There were frictions, there were disagreements, there were blowouts. And I found, and still find, that the most challenging part of this, when one tries to look at it more holistically, from roughly 1967 until roughly Mikhail Gorbachev comes into power, is, on the one hand, not going down rabbit holes of mythology, and communal memory and triumphalism, which of course is in any Jewish history tends to happen. But on the other hand, not giving into sort of empty revisionism of just trying to blow up those old beliefs just because they're old or they seem overblown. And that particularly because we're dealing in this issue, both the issue in Jewish Currents and the topic as a whole, for the most part with people who are still alive. This is not, it's not history. We're not talking about the Middle Ages or the First World War. You and Anna, we have two of our participants on the panel who are in fact living objects of the subject, young living objects. So the balance here I found to be, it's both challenging and absolutely titillating in a way, in trying to tell this story and not just taking a side because we come from that place or because we have some political view going into the analysis that we're trying to do.
Thank you. things that you found challenging in conceptualizing your essay, if anybody else would like to take that. Anna?
I wanted to talk about what Jonathan said. I don't know, maybe I'll come to challenges too. So to me, it was interesting how, when I was growing up, I heard about this movement. And I heard about this movement from my father, who was saying, how could people involved in this movement, trying to get connections with the West, or trying to leave the Soviet Union, how could they be so selfish and leave their family behind, leave their friends behind, endanger their family members? And my whole kind of attitude toward this movement in my childhood, long before I did Jewish studies or even thought a lot about being Jewish or anything like this, was this balance between what's good for you, or maybe what's good for the greater good, or what's good for your family. And in the Soviet context, those two things are almost always contradict each other. So, so what's good for your family and what's good for their greater good, always bad things happen in the name of greater good too. So I've always thought about this movement, and then, I studied more and I learned what it took actually for the Western Jewish community, especially when I moved to Canada and I met all these people who were advocating tirelessly to allow Jews who wanted to leave and all this. It became more complex, but this approach, but what also I was thinking was interesting, how the story of Soviet Jews, refuseniks who actually left as essentially of heroes, remained unchallenged until today. They're the heroes who were brave and who were not passive, who took action and who left. And to me, that's a myth that I wanted to think deeper about. So maybe Jonathan is right. Maybe sometimes it is correct. Sometimes there are other factors too. And then I started studying the history of the Holocaust and started thinking about all these people who have guns in ghettos. They were fighting, but they were also endangering, and all sorts of things like this. The Jewish history is full with these examples. And it was interesting for me to think about this movement that way. And by the way, it's interesting to think about, almost none of it ended up in my piece that I wrote for Jewish Currents, because that piece is based on sources, on archival materials and in-depth research and stuff like this. And that part of the movement didn't get studied by me at this, so I didn't include that. I hope, Sasha, I answered your question a little bit.
Sure. Tova?
Yeah, I'll talk about the section kind of as a whole. And I think what Anna and Jonathan are saying very much resonates for me, because first of all, this is a contested history in some ways. I think it's still very much contested. There's an exhibit that's going to be coming out, right? The stuff that Anna has talked about refuseniks as these kind of unchallenged heroes, this sort of tension between staying or leaving, the idea of what role American Jews actually played in affecting this immigration. I think that all remains very much alive. And so that's just, first of all, the initial challenge going into this. And then I think for us in Jewish Currents, putting this together, and myself and Ariel Engel, the editor-in-chief, who very much played a large role in conceptualizing this together with me, it was that we were trying to do a revisionist history at the same time as we were introducing it to readers. So we knew kind of going in that the majority of the readership would never have heard of this movement. Maybe their parents participated in it. There's a picture of them, in a stroller somewhere, right? That's something that some people have a conception of, but they really wouldn't maybe appreciate the extent of the movement, how important it was, how strong feeling is for some of the activists who participated. And that was kind of a writing challenge, right? That we wanted to say, oh, this is popularly conceived of as a human rights movement. However, we're going to sort of poke holes in that conception. A more kind of significant conceptual challenge was this idea of why did this movement happen in the first place? And I think the scholarly consensus, not consensus because it's still sort of debated, but a lot of the suggestions of why it happened, we found kind of dissatisfying. And there are scholars who also find dissatisfying, who are excellent, like, Shel Kellner, et cetera. And so there's this sort of popular idea that 1967, let's say, played a very large role in both fomenting, let's say, the Jewish national movement in the Soviet Union, which is the study of Hebrew, the rediscovering of, Jewish identity, and then also in the US. And this is this idea that, the 6-Day War happened, and then people feel very awakened and alive, and they want to fight for a Jewish cause. And this kind of combined with trauma over the genocide of Jews in Europe or the Holocaust. And this, I think a lot of scholars feel, and sort of we felt too, when putting this together, is an idea about what Jewishness is, and how Jews are thinking about themselves that both sort of overemphasizes kind of what Jonathan was talking about, right? These national ideas of, global Jewish unity. And it's almost like a religious conception of Jewishness, I would say, right? That there's like this hidden spark that can be like activated by these events that happen. And it's also just not true necessarily, right? That 1967 didn't have the impact in the way that it's kind of popularly told. Jews were studying Hebrew in the Soviet Union before 67. The movement in the US was actually much more inspired by kind of social and political, the 60s environment, right? And so that was something that we kind of wanted to try to figure out, which is explaining why this movement took place and not overemphasizing these global Jewish unity narratives, and instead sort of doing that localizing, which Sasha, you talked about in your wonderful introduction to all of our pieces. And so the solution to that conceptual challenge was to do what you sort of see here represented on the panel, which was breaking up the kind of wings of the movement, if you want to put it that way, and having each of these wings be looked at in very much the domestic kind of political context of what was happening at the time. And so I think, like Anna talked about, her piece drives it home in a certain way because she's not looking at necessarily only the refuseniks. I mean, she's also looking at the reason why Jews immigrated. And anti-Semitism, as she finds and as she writes about, is not sort of the driving force or a causal explanation that people want it to be, which is a causal explanation that's similar maybe to 1967 in that sense, right? Like it's something that animates or unites Jews across the globe, when in fact, what she's looking at is the very specific, like Chernobyl, for example, played a much larger role, let's say, in inspiring people's immigration than anti-Semitism. And so that kind of conceptual challenge was something we were able to balance by splitting up into all these different pieces and then putting them together to say at the same time, this was a transnational Jewish movement, right? I mean, there were uniting forces, and not to ignore that, but then also to kind of keep in mind these domestic, the external factors.
Hadass, thank you, Tova.
Yeah, I can respond to some of those. So to expand on the conceptual question that Tova just said of wanting to wrestle with why did this movement emerge as a global phenomenon when it did. I guess for some of the participants, this is a especially interesting question because the movement emerged after the worst and most violent period of repression against Jews in the Soviet Union. So the movement emerges in the late 60s and the 70s, but this is not actually the time of the worst repression. So why now? Why now in the US and around the world? And this is a question that doesn't just apply to the campaign for Soviet Jewry. It's actually true for the global human rights movements that emerged at the same time. So Jews were not the only ones fighting in this period for human rights, but people around the world in the former Soviet Union, but also in other countries and in post-colonial countries were fighting for human rights, really becoming a force in the 70s. And again, this is decades after World War II when the world saw genocide. Why didn't this human rights as a grassroots movement emerge then? So this is something that not just historians of Jews need to ask, but the historians as a whole. And Jews were part of that general phenomena. And I think some of what Tova and Ariel achieved in curating this section is showing that the Jewish social movements were very much part of the broader trends in the domestic countries where they lived. I think for me, another answer for why it emerged when it did is this question of politics. And this was the major challenge that I had in conceptualizing the piece, because on the one hand, and especially when you read the memoirs, when you read some of the oral interviews that were conducted with activists and some of the documents, you see that this is really about human rights. For the American Jews, this is really about the relationships they formed with Soviet Jews, even if it was only through writing one letter that they don't even know the recipient. But the impact of it was undeniable. It was extremely meaningful. So that's at the individual level, that's at the communal level, but human rights are political. The movements had an aim to change government action. They pursued lobbying, they made appeal to elected officials, they interacted with the party system. It was very much a political process where the domestic context of fights between Republicans and Democrats over policy, fights between the president and Congress over who will control foreign policy, fights within the Democratic Party over the direction of foreign policy, all of those are highly politicized and very much affected, I think, the shape of and the direction that the Soviet Jewry movement took, at least in the US.
Tova, yes.
Yeah, can I add one more thing just off of what Hadass was saying? Something that we didn't get to include in this section, but Olesia's work, and she does have a piece that I think is really wonderful, and the piece that she has in the section is part of a broader kind of dissertation and the research that she did, trying to put Jews, their kind of rediscovery, right, of Jewish languages and Hebrew and all that. She puts that very much into the context of what was happening in the Soviet Union in the 70s, sort of culturally and socially. And for her, she calls this like the search for the extraordinary, as like a broader, yes, this is her piece, as like a broader kind of cultural moment that was happening. And something she was also very interested in, which does somewhat make it into the piece, was what allowed Jews to have the time in the Soviet Union to kind of discover some of these cultural backgrounds or pick up like hobbies, right? And how when they emigrate to the US and Israel, they sort of lose that time or that ability to pursue those cultural and intellectual interests. So that was one way. And then another piece we didn't get to include, but there's a graduate student, Sam Finkelman, who's doing really interesting research looking at the Jewish national movement alongside other nationality groups and national movements in the Soviet Union, like Ukrainian, national movements, for example, right? So thinking about Jews' rediscovery of their identity, not just kind of as a single force that was happening, but something that occurred alongside a lot of other sort of national rediscovery movements. And so that's sort of parallel to what Hadass was talking about, what was going on in the US. And then as far as Israel goes, I originally, when we were putting the piece together, the popular story about Israel's involvement in the movement is very much like secret agency, working behind the scenes, government officials, this organization called Nativ. And I didn't really think, mostly because I sort of had researched read the least about Israel's involvement, I didn't think we would be able to get that same kind of grassroots story about Israel. And that's why Jonathan's piece was so exciting, because it really showed how these three kind of were paralleling each other.
Thank you for these wonderful answers. So I'm kind of trying to, again, kind of think about what all of you said about the kind of the challenges question, right? So there's I think Jonathan and Anna, to some extent, spoke really kind of beautifully about the difficulty of balancing, right, the kind of cerebral interest in the subject, which is driven by historical methods, right, of looking at sources and interpreting sources, and the communal narratives, including by people who are still very much around, right? So it's and you two yourselves occupy this sort of intermediate positions between these kinds of categories. To then thinking about kind of how Tova and Hadassah framed it, also about how, and I think in some ways, right, this is what students of Jewish history and Jewish culture know, is that any subject on, whatever aspect of the Jewish experience is always part of the broader set of global stories, right? So when you think about the Soviet Jewry movement alongside other, right, human rights movements, you need to be thinking about the Cold War era more broadly, whether you're thinking globally or in the context of the United States. And I think maybe one other thing that really isn't so much represented in this block of articles, but is also the story, and this you could see in, there's work by Mike Dorlinger, for example, about thinking about specifically the United States and the kind of context of the American part of the movement as really a kind of turning inward from the larger civil rights struggles in the United States, as kind of the civil rights kind of movement where Jews are very active. Earlier on, as the kind of Black Power movements take off, there's some kind of movement inward in the attempt to try to build the Soviet Jewry movement in the kind of guise of these other movements in the United States. So Mark Dollinger, for example, writes about Meir Kahane, right, and the sort of the rise of the Jewish Defense League and its connection to the Soviet Jewry movement as trying to kind of replicate something similar in that context. So with this, you kind of set this really interesting wings, right? The kind of the different domestic wings of the larger story, of the larger Jewish story, but also of the larger kind of global narrative. And I guess it makes me wonder about what, this is coming out now in 2022, right? We're looking at this in this kind of complicated way today. What to you is the implication, right, of revisiting these narratives in the ways that you do in terms of contemporary Jewish politics and cultural memory, right? And the place of the Soviet Jewry movement in the way that it shapes Jewish cultural memory and politics going forward. Anne, I think, is the hand.
So, it came up not so long ago when, the war in Ukraine happened. And there was a meeting that I participated in here in Toronto, and what do we do? How do we help Jews in Ukraine? And also, how do we help Jews in Russia who, now can't leave and want to leave and all this? And there were many obstacles to that discussion. And it was interesting to me how people involved in the Soviet Jewry movement was like riding a bike for them. They knew exactly which organizations are effective, which ones are not. A lot of conversation was that, the major obstacle we have to overcome from Jewish organizations is to not direct everyone to Israel, and the narrative is, how do you explain that not everyone wants to go to Israel? That came up first, then, JIS, this and that. And I have to say, I was astonished at how they were the only ones in the room who knew exactly what to do. And suddenly I thought, well, maybe this study and this issue is not purely academic and enlightening the public, but there's something about this communal organization that really worked at that time and can be translated into the present.
Fascinating. Anybody else kind of what role might kind of looking at what is the reason for looking at the Soviet Jewry movement in this way to kind of an implication to contemporary politics and memory? Jonathan.
Well, two things come up. Actually, a lot more do, but I'll just mention two. You remarked in your opening that part of what my essay talked about is how Israel at the time had to navigate, better or worse, had to navigate between superpowers, between the Soviet Union and the United States, when dealing with the Soviet Jewry movement. And therefore, some of its actions may have seemed rather surprising to contemporary observers, and even 30, 40 years later. And some contemporary observers were infuriated that the government of Israel, no matter which party you're talking about, wasn't doing more explicitly to help Soviet Jewry. So that's a dilemma that I addressed in the article. But thinking about 2022, I think it's important to point out that same phenomenon, or a very similar phenomenon, is at work today, where the Israeli government since February of 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Israeli government has had to navigate yet again a rather difficult situation in which the United States is angry with it, the Ukrainians are angry with it, and to an extent the Russians are angry with Israel because Israel hasn't done what they would have preferred for Israel to do during this time. And Israel has to figure out somehow how to navigate this mess and still protect its own vital national interests. And so what's old is new again, in a way, separated by 50 years or so. And the other part that I would point out that has, it's more than just echoes. These are real trends, real things that seem to bridge time, is that another sort of pivotal part of my essay dealt with what was called then and still is known in the scholarship as the dropout crisis. And what that all meant, meaning some of the Soviet Jews, the refuseniks, so we thought, once they arrived in Vienna and Rome, purportedly on their way to Israel, decided to take a left and immigrate to usually North America. And it became a huge crisis in the Jewish world between Israel and these people themselves. The refuseniks back in Russia were furious about this, and many of the American advocacy organizations and philanthropies just didn't even know what to do. And this kind of confusion, in a way, is reflected today as well. And I think part of our job, I would hope, part of our job as historians on more public platforms like this or otherwise, is to help the public figure out really, or to separate between the noise and what is actually happening. So in the case of the dropouts, of course, depending on who you listen to in the old narratives, you know, it's absolutely clear who's the villain and who's the hero. And again, depending on what side you're taking, those answers become very, very clear. But from a more detached historical perspective, it becomes much blurrier. Now, today, we struggle, I think, in the Jewish world. Israel doesn't struggle enough, but everybody else does, in terms of understanding Israel's place in the Jewish world as a whole, not just as a homeland for the Jews, but what's its place in its interactions with diaspora Jewry. And if we go back those 50 years and try to really, I would say, soberly understand those interactions, that can be really helpful in instructing us today on sort of what's gone so terribly wrong in interactions between the government, the state of Israel, and so many diaspora communities today. Because from my interpretation of it, and I think I mentioned this in the article, the downhill slide began there in the dropout crisis between American Jewish organizations, certainly, and the government or governments of Israel.
Tova. Thank you, Jonathan.
So I guess to the question of the implication of this group of essays to current cultural memory, I'll take it in a little bit of a different direction. I did, because we wrote and we conceptualized this section before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it was very surprising, you know, after the invasion of Ukraine, how, like Anna said, what's old is, or maybe Jonathan, I can't remember, what's old is new again, where you have people saying, you know, the dropout crisis kind of coming back, to what Anna said about, you know, what's effective, what to do, what kind of steps to take. Something that I think is really interesting about revisiting this history about, for example, Hadassah's piece looks at the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And that amendment, or that legislative achievement, if you want to put it that way, right, is sort of held up as a kind of, you know, watershed moment in the Soviet Jewry movement. It was Jewish organizing basically went so far as to pass this major legislative victory that helped, you know, Jewish immigration. And there's an article by a former graduate student at NYU that sort of breaks down actually the immigration patterns against the passing of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which linked trade to Soviet Jewish immigration. And he basically argues that actually the amendment didn't have any success in the way that, or didn't really have as much success as American Jewish activists thought, that immigration actually dropped off after the amendment was passed. And so I think that's sort of like one thing to sort of, to separate and think about, which is what's effective, right, in foreign policy and grassroots organizing in that way. The second, more just sort of broadly thinking about what kind of got me interested in the global Jewish unity stuff, right? If you're, and the Soviet issue as a whole, I mean, something that the Jewish Currents editors and myself and some others were thinking about was the way that the history of Jewish communists or Jews in the Soviet Union is kind of used against Jewish organizing today, especially anti-Zionist Jewish organizing. And for the Soviet Jewry movement, a lot of these arguments about like anti-Semitism, coming from the left, I think a lot of that comes out of this history. And that was something that we wanted to kind of explore and like take apart and take a step back from and be like, well, where does this come from, right? Is there such a thing as like, left anti-Semitism historically in this way? And the idea that the nostalgia that exists, I see Glenn Richter, who was very big in the movement, kind of talking. Maybe we can mention that in the Q&A. But yeah, the nostalgia that I think exists today, where there's this a lot of sense of like, oh, there was so much unity, people really gathered together. I mean, we've all talked about how that wasn't true. But I also think that that impulse comes from, Jewish communal leaders and organizations of these sort of nonprofits looking around and being like, why are all these young Jews, becoming anti-Zionists or non-Zionists, right? Why do they oppose, Israel's occupation, all of that? And I think that nostalgia is like fueling or serving that anxiety that is felt over like, why can't we all come together over a cause? And like, oh, there was this time when we all came together over this cause. And so that was sort of this like impulse that first got me interested in it. And then I think when we are revisiting the history and looking at that and how that sort of serves to the cultural memory, like Hadass mentioned at the beginning, right, there wasn't always kind of like, what does it mean when we say there was a consensus, or how was a kind of consensus built, right? And so, yeah, that's some of the implications that I hope.
Hadass, thank you, Tova.
Yes, we're starting to have an order to the order we go in. So thinking about the implications, and some of these are similar to what others have said before me, but I think there's two main ones. One, just to any young aspiring activist that would like to be able to effectively organize people to do something together and maybe take personal risk. I think looking at, and I said this in the beginning, and the more I study and read about this movement, I think there is much to learn even today about how to mobilize mass numbers of people, really bringing in people who have never taken political action before, getting housewives who have never gone to a protest to take time off and go to a protest in the early 80s or late 70s, getting people to commit to calling, to adopt a family and check up on them once a week. All of these things, I think, take a lot of labor, and to get people to do that labor for free is something that is always good to learn how to do. The other question that I think today, and maybe especially for Jewish Currents readers, to reflect about is the role of American Jews in shaping US foreign policy. And this is something that historians of foreign policy always think about, is what is the role of domestic politics and what is the role of civil society in shaping what states choose to do amongst themselves. And this movement raises questions. How much did it actually shape what leaders of the American government choose to do? And it seems they did shape it. But a question, especially reading about the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, a question I had was, if Jackson hadn't had this agenda that he had before the Soviet Jewry movement, would it have passed? And would the amendment have passed? Would the Soviet Jewry movement be able to get its agenda if there weren't already forces that had their own interests in getting this amendment passed? And so I think something that we see, and I hope this came out a little in the piece, but how much Nixon and Jackson really were just pulling the Jewish establishment between them. And many heads of Jewish institutions complained about this. And the forces that won within the Soviet Jewry movement. So I do think that the young idealistic activists in this regard did win and get their vision passed. And they did this both by the impressive organizing, which I mentioned, but also by aligning themselves with specific forces in the Democratic Party that for their own reasons wanted to advocate for a more interventionist and a hawkish policy. And I think today, if we have groups of people who are interested in shaping American foreign policy, it's important to reflect on which elements are we aligning with, and also what existing fights that maybe have nothing to do with Jews are we entering into. So in the 70s, this was a fight I wrote about a little between the more progressive challenges in the Democratic Party, represented by McGovern and the anti-Vietnam movement, and the forming hawkish parts of the Democratic Party around Jackson and the groups who became neoconservative. And I think today we have a very similar situation in the Democratic Party, where there are forces between more established elements of the party and growing progressive powers, and conflicts about how to shape American foreign policy definitely enter into that. And I think Jewish activists, leftist activists, need to think about their activism in that context, not only in the context of Zionism or American Jewish community, but what is happening in the country as a whole.
So we have just a few minutes left. Let me kind of wrap up your responses, add a little bit, and then I'll ask one last question, kind of a short question. This is really just fascinating for me to hear, especially kind of the way that Anna and Jonathan talked in the beginning about the way that this history looks very interesting in the context of the last 3 months and of Russia's latest invasion of Ukraine, right, in 2022, in the way that both from the point of view of like organizing, there's something to learn, right, and Anna pointing out that the activists, the veterans in the movement are kind of aware of what to do in terms of when it comes to question of Ukrainian Jews and Russian Jews, but also what Jonathan says about Israel's kind of tricky role in this current crisis. And then I'm thinking also about kind of what Hadass points to, and Tova also in their responses about a kind of, I guess, how the political reality of the Soviet Jewry movement was in some ways a product of a kind of accidental alignment of pre-existing political agendas of various actors, right? And the way that this particular issue had dovetailed with, Scoop Jackson's, kind of hawkishness towards the Soviet Union. And I'm kind of thinking about what you're saying, Hadass, especially in the kind of thinking about this question of implications of this memory on the present. There are other things we can think about, right? So Jonathan, in your comment, you talked about the question of the dropouts, right? And the sort of really tricky subject of how, of the people who immigrated during the Soviet period, most did not go to Israel and possibly did not want to go to Israel, and how that story gets left out of the communal retelling. I remember this documentary from maybe 2005 or so called The Refusenik, and I remember it kind of hyping up the Refuseniks and talking about Sharansky, and then ending with like 1.5 million Jews went to Israel. I'm like, well, what about the ones who went to America, right? That is so many, right? So like there are these kinds of moments that get left out, and I really appreciated what you all had to say about the role and the responsibility of the scholar and the historian who looks at this in a kind of responsible fashion to tell this narrative. I'm also thinking about how, in some cases, we can think about how some political actors kind of cultural capital, if I can put it that way, was established in the process of the Soviet Jewry movement and is still being spent today in ways that might not have been expected. You know, if you think about someone like Natan Sharansky and his continued sort of building on his, you know, persona as the most famous refusnik, and the way that that gets him to advise George W. Bush on invading Iraq, and it gets him to defend George W. Bush as a refusnik president, dissident president when that war is going badly, right? So there are these kinds of continuations and the echoes very much in contemporary politics. So maybe the last question to wrap this up is, you've all did just really stellar work in your essays, because they're short, right? Because they have to be. This is they're shortish. They're for a mass circulation magazine. But you did a wonderful job introducing really complex parts of a subject. So I guess I wanted to ask you, you know, what stories do you think remain to be told? Tova.
I think that there's, I mean, for me, there's like so many things, because we could only fit a few thousand words, like you said, and I think everyone here did such an amazing job putting such a complicated history into short pieces. Two things I feel sad that we didn't get to include, or that I think people should read on their own, that I think would be very interesting to look at again, was first, Sasha already mentioned this, but you know, Mark Dollinger has a really wonderful essay about Black power in Jewish politics, and the relationship between figures like Meir Kahane and the Soviet Jewry movement, and like Black freedom movements. And we just completely didn't get to interrogate at all the relationship between, you know, the Soviet Jewry movement in the US and civil rights and all of that. So that's one thing that I think is very interesting and that we didn't get to include. And then another is this big question of immigration and immigration policy in the US. So when there's Sasha actually mentioned this to me, and then Fred Lazin, who wrote a wonderful book also. And it's this idea, I guess, that when Jews were dropping out of Israel, there was pressure on US immigration policy to not allow as many Jews to come in, so that they would be rerouted back to Israel. And then there was also this political, or just complicated question of how Jews were classified when they came into the Soviet Union. And as people here who kind of know more than me can step in, but there was this question of, like, you know, Soviet Jews as refugees. And that sort of put a lot of Jews who were coming in this position to articulate their stories in a very specific way. And so just in general, the immigration policy around, you know, Soviet Jews and how that all happened, I think that would have been a very interesting thing to kind of include that we didn't get a chance to do.
Jonathan.
Yeah, I guess I hate to be a kind of party pooper. I think that the work that is getting done now is very good, and I appreciate the effort that people like us are investing in. But I think what remains to be done, in a way, is for all of us to take who are looking at one or another aspect of the Soviet Jewry movement, to take or to constantly do reality checks. Because as Anna mentioned, you know, in the Soviet sphere, relatively few people actually participated in the national Jewish revival in the Soviet Union. And those former Soviet Jews who, you know, are honest enough also admit it, that that's simply the truth. So we have to move, but it's true in all of these phases. The same is true in the United States. Yes, yes, I wrote postcards and wore, you know, pins and all sorts of other things, but it was a minority phenomenon. It doesn't matter how colorful Kahana was, or the student struggle, or others. It was always a minority phenomenon. And the same is true of Israel, that was very hesitant, and most Israelis never mobilized for the Soviet Jewry movement. So on the one hand, again, going back to that balance, what remains to be done is, on the one hand, looking hard and soberly at what was done, right, in all of these spheres. But on the other hand, being honest enough with ourselves to understand it doesn't matter how many triumphalist books are written by this former activist or that former activist or this journalist or that journalist, that the totality of this was limited in many ways. And so that would be a wonderful thing if we can reach and if we can reach that balance. I think it'll be much more instructive and helpful than where we are currently at, with, yes, shelves full of lots of books that and articles that don't necessarily help us understand the totality of the Jewish world during this Soviet Jewry movement.
Anna, thank you.
So it's so interesting to hear, my colleagues about what's unanswered questions. And, I guess we're coming up with this thing that there's so many unanswered questions. But to me, I think the circle could come back and maybe thinking about Soviet Jewry movement of the 70s and its impact on, the destination countries. That is something that could be still explored. And I'm reading this Ben Rifkin's really interesting comment here about attending a Seder in the 70s, I think, in Leningrad, and thinking, well, I'm there, and I'm listening to, attending all these Jews speaking, Soviet Jews speaking Hebrew, and thinking, oh, how bad is my Hebrew? So that's a narrative that gave me, which reminded me of what are all these Jews doing once they came to the West? So far that whole narrative is that they got improved, they became more Jewish, they became more religious, they became more active, or they became Americans, they became free people. Somebody's writing in the chat that too, they liberated and all that stuff. But the story must be more complex than that, right? So it's, and I think that work is not done with the 70s. It's definitely not done with the Jews who came in the 90s and later. And I think once you put people front and center, suddenly the categories like success, globalism, and all this, they become less, important, but the trajectories, the decisions, the nuance, something that we celebrate in humanities, social science actually become subjects of study. And I think once this point of view is taken, that when Soviet Jews left, they became important players of modern Jewish society and global Jewish society and global society in general, then we'll have new studies as well. And I'm looking forward to that.
Hadas.
I can start responding to some of the comments. Is that okay?
Sure. You are the last one, so do what you'd like to do.
So I wanted to highlight a comment from Glenn Richter, who was the national coordinator of Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry that I had mentioned in the beginning, and responsible both for a lot of the organizing that I mentioned we should pay attention to, but also a lot of the sources a lot of historians use today in researching the history of the movement. So the comment is that with the Jackson-Vanik amendment, they were looking for results, not for associating with one ideology or another, and Jackson was willing to take the risk. And I hear that. And I think that's one of the interesting questions. I don't know if we can make how much generalizations we can make, but that's the interesting question of what are the implications of making alliances for pragmatic reasons versus because of some ideological pre-made commitment. So I wanted to highlight that comment. That's it.
Okay, and I think Tova, maybe that's the last word. Was that a hand? I wasn't sure. Yeah.
Sure. Just a short comment, kind of off of what Hadas was saying, that, and I see we're over time, but when I was first putting my first essay together and then this section, Ariel kind of asked me an interesting question that I still think about, when thinking about the Soviet Jewry movement and this history, which was just like, well, not everyone can organize for everything, right? And I guess that's something that I'm still kind of left with, which is, how do we choose the causes that we do, and how do we organize around them? And kind of what Hadas is pointing out, what made this movement something that was able to align, let's say, with someone like Jackson or not, right? And so, yeah, how do we organize for everything is something I still think about.
Thank you all so much. I mean, this was really an amazing discussion. Let me just say kind of the thing that really impresses me the most about our conversation, but also about the special issue and the articles in it, is that in some ways, right, what Jonathan said, that what remains to be said is, for example, emphasizing how some of the stories we're telling are quite limited, right? So if we think about the activists in the Soviet Union are quite few in number, right? But that those stories get amplified and then they feed into the various communal memories. That kind of story is so complex to tell, as are the others that Anna and Hadassah and Tova had talked about, that it maybe does take, a group of people to kind of tease out those kinds of complexity. And I think it's rare for a story to be told that way by a number of people who maybe realize, right, the complexity and the enormity of the challenge of taking it upon any one of us in particular to tell that whole story. So, I mean, I again commend all of you, and I commend, of course, Tova and Ariel Angel and the editorial board and team of Jewish Currents to really taking this on as trying to tell in a fairly succinct way, begin to tell in a fairly succinct, begin to gesture towards this complexity of a story that maybe no single person can own or tell on their own, and really requires this kind of massive collaborative effort. So that was just really wonderful to speak to all of you. I wish we were in person. Zoom allows us to be speaking from 3 different countries at the same time. That's of course the advantage, but I look forward to seeing you all in person next time that I can. And thank you all, and to the audience for coming.
Thank you. And thank you, Sasha, for moderating.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, everyone, for attending.